and welcome to the Ride Around the Murray Festival. I'm Jane Rawson. I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri elders and the Wiradjuri country on which the Ride Around the Murray Festival is based in Albury. I'm coming to you from Lutruwita Aboriginal land, which we call Tasmania. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of the land, the Palawa people, who belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. Welcome to our viewers and listeners on YouTube and on Facebook Live. Toward the end of the session, I'll be taking your questions and you can submit those via your chat function. In this session, Animal Magnetism, I'm talking with Chris Flynn, Laura Jean McKay, and James Bradley about their wonderful new novels, Mammoth, The Animals in That Country. Sorry, Laura, I've got the prototype version here, not the real live version. And Ghost Species, getting a lot of shine off that. Hi, Chris. Chris is also the author of The Glass Kingdom and A Tiger in Eden, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize. His fiction and non-fiction have appeared in The Age, The Australian, Griffith Review, Meanjin, Australian Book Review, Saturday Papers, and a lot of other places. And he's conducted interviews for the Paris Review and is a regular presenter at literary festivals across Australia. Chris is coming to us from Phillip Island, next to a penguin sanctuary. Laura Jean is the author of Holiday in Cambodia, shortlisted for 3 National Book Awards in Australia. Her work appears in The Guardian, Best Australian Stories, and the North American Review. And she's a lecturer in creative writing at Massey University with a PhD from the University of Melbourne focusing on literary animal studies. She's the animal expert presenter on ABC Listen's Animal Sound Safari and is coming to us from New Zealand. And James Bradley is an author and critic. His other books are the novels Rack, The Deep Field, The Resurrectionist, and Clade. There are some books not on here. He has heaps of books, a book of poetry, Paper Nautilus, and the Penguin Book of the Ocean. His work has won or been shortlisted for a number of major Australian and international literary awards. And in 2012, he won the Pascal Prize for Australia's Critic of the Year and is coming to us from Sydney. Hello, everybody. To kick off, I wonder if each of you could give the viewers a short description of your book, starting with Chris.
Oh, okay. A short description.
Oh, yeah.
It began in 13,000. No. So my book, Mammoth, is basically set the night before a natural history auction in New York in 2007, which was a real auction. And all of the bones that are on display that are about to go up for sale the next day are megafauna and other creatures. And they are talking to each other, explaining how they came to wind up on sale at the auction. And in doing so, the book jumps back to the end of the Ice Age and to the start of the 19th century, which is when several of the bones were dug up, and it follows their journey, in particular between about 1800 and 1804 in America, France, and Ireland, particularly the mammoth, as he is transported around and displayed in museums for the edification of the two-legged people who have no idea what he is. So it's a bit of a romp through history as the animals observe our behavior through time. There you go.
Got lots of good jokes in it. Laura, you go.
Tēnā koutou. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here for a moment in Australia from New Zealand. So this is The Animals in That Country. I feel like every time I try to give a description of it in my own words, book sales actually go down. But I'll give it a go. So this book asks what would happen if the language barrier was taken away and we could talk to other animals. And it's told through the eyes of Jean, who is a woman who works in a wildlife park. She loves a drink. She loves a smoke. She doesn't like people very much, but she does really love a dingo called Sue. And when Sue she doesn't speak, but when she starts to understand what Sue is saying with her body, they go on this epic road trip through sort of pandemic-riddled, what we might call Australia.
I thought that's pretty good. I'd buy a copy.
Oh, thanks, Jane. Sold.
To add to the 3 I have already.
That's right.
How about you, James? Tell us about Ghost Species.
I now have a copy to hold up as well because everyone else did. Ghost Species begins kind of now. It is about a billionaire who has a plan to re-engineer the Earth's climate by resurrecting extinct species and rebuilding ancient ecosystems. And within that, he's got this plan to recreate Neanderthals. And it's about the scientists who create the first of those children, and it's about that child growing up over about the next 20 years against a kind of background of hastening climate catastrophe.
Good summary. Thank you all. We all know that Australian readers really love novels about like war and convicts and beaches and coming of age and marriages in disarray, and that all of these novels are about humans. We also know that writing a novel takes a really long time and is very painful. So what was it that made each of you want to embark on a book featuring a non-human character? And did you ever wonder if you'd made a terrible mistake? Laura?
I honestly, when I started writing the animals in that country, I thought that it would be quite fun. I thought it was quite a fun premise to imagine what other animals were saying. But of course, as we all know, as soon as we start to look at human-animal or human-non-human relationships, we realize how truly evil and nasty the human species is. So I worked at this book for around 7 years, 7 to 10. And I'd say about halfway through, I realized what a terrible idea it was, but I'd written so much and I'd told everyone I was writing this thing. So I just had to keep going and try to make it not a terrible idea and something that might live on the page and actually be both enjoyable to read, I hope, and start to get into some of those intense ideas around how we are in the world with other species and how we might be in the future.
James, what made you want to write about a Neanderthal child?
Two things. First of all, I would argue my protagonist is human, which is one of the things the book's about, rather than non-human.
Yeah, but you're messing with the premise of my question if you say that.
So to go back to the premise of your question, I was once killing time at Perth Airport, and I remember looking at the Australiana section. They had a kind of Australiana section in the bookshop, and they had 37 titles, and one of them was not about war. The other 36 were all about war. So, yes, our self-perception is very much connected to war. Look, I guess I wanted to think about what it must be like to be different in the way that the Neanderthal child is in the book, but also to think about various kinds of, I guess, kind of loneliness, because there's a sense that she has been recreated and she is this kind of isolate. She's the only one of her kind in a really profound way that I think is quite difficult for us to imagine. And it seemed to me that kind of loneliness was a great way of thinking about, I guess, a whole series of questions around the kind of process of extinction, the disappearance of species, that sense that the world is growing lonelier all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chris, yours is primarily a historical fiction novel, I guess, and there are heaps of interesting human characters in it. What made you decide that the mammoth was the right person to take over narration of this?
Well, I kind of like how you've couched the question about why we're writing these books, Jane, because this book was a bit of a reaction from me to those very typical Australian books, which is, you know, the grim road trip, the sort of outback novel, the wartime history novel. I was sick to death of reading those books, and the lack of imagination and, you know, fantasy and even science fiction that we see in Australian literature has always been a frustration to me. That's why I've always, you know, got on well with James and loved what he does, because he's been working in that field, but in sort of mainstream literature, and that's a good encouragement to me. So Mammoth for me was, I wanted to do historical fiction, but from a really alternative, sort of almost fantastical perspective, but grounded in as much reality as I could. So there's most of the human characters in it are real people who actually existed. And so they're just being observed by these creatures who are on sale at the auction. As to whether that was a terrible idea or not, I think it's absolutely a terrible idea. And I quickly realized that. And I just thought, to hell with it. I'm just going to go ahead anyway, because I'm 48 years old now, and this is my third book, and I've got a million ideas for books, and they're all terrible. That's what I've realized. All my ideas are terrible, but I'm still going to do them. So as long as I can find a gullible publisher to take me on and actually put the book out, then I'm going to continue writing terrible books that maybe not terrible books, but terrible ideas that and trying to make them work.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of the amazing thing about all of these books. I can imagine as the author trying to explain to someone what it is I'm trying to write and having them go, what? Why? But then when you read the book, you're like, of course, why? Of course, this is great. This is such a good idea. So clearly you're all very good at writing. Well done.
It does create a problem, though, because as soon as you release a book like this, you're constantly, like any of our books, you're constantly having to explain what they are. Like, it's not like people just walk into a shop and they say, "Oh, what's that? Oh, it's got a ram or something on the cover. It's about animals."
I prefer to call it a power ram, actually, Chris.
A power ram, right?
Yeah.
But you have to explain what the books are about, and so therefore you automatically have that barrier between you and the reader. It's not like we're not working in that form of Australian fiction that is like super easily accessible to someone who just wanders into a bookshop. They pick up a book. It's a crime thriller about someone who has returned to the small town where they grew up, and there's a murder that happened there years ago, and they're somehow caught up in it. There's a million of those books, and people instantly know what they are. But these books are a bit trickier. So it's good that we're doing all these events because we get a chance to actually explain to people what the books are about.
I have a very good friend who's a science fiction person, editor, and when I told him what I was writing about, he said, "Oh, well, I won't read it then. I don't read books with Neanderthals in them." Which didn't feel very supportive at the time, I have to say.
It's a bit of a subgenre, I guess, Neanderthal fiction.
The good news is that all those people who've been dying to read books with Neanderthals in them now finally have a chance, thanks to James and a couple of other people. And I think that's the great thing about these sorts of books is there are plenty of people who have read enough crime fiction stories set in small towns now and are desperate for something else to read. And your books are all awesome examples of new ways of thinking about writing in Australian fiction. They're really, really great. I'm interested in whether it was important to each of you that your characters were factually accurate as well as working as characters. I mean, they all work. Your dingo, your Neanderthal, your mammoth all work really well as characters. Did you feel like you needed to do stacks of research before you launched into this, or did you just go, as long as people are interested in them, that's enough? Oh, a wombat just ran across the hill. Animals. James, did you have to do a lot of research?
I did a little bit. I don't know. One of the things that I always feel really shifty about is that I keep ending up doing things. And Chris was talking about the kind of infusion I'm doing, where people talk about all the research I did, and I was like, I didn't do all that much research. Like, I read a few books and then kind of made stuff up. But look, I decided quite early on, and I do this quite often with books, is that people aren't very interested in the detail of the research. Like, what they want it to do is to feel plausible. And so what you need to do is you need to know enough to write without feeling anxious about what you don't know, in a sense. But with this, there were some real things about trying to think my way around what Neanderthals would have been like. And the answer to that is we know a lot, but the scientists all seem to argue with each other about what it means. As scientists want to do. So I did a thing quite early on about just deciding a few things about some kind of parameters of what my character was like, and then kind of working with them. But and look, they're informed by the research. Perhaps we'll put it that way. They're informed by the research, and I mean, and there's a kind of, I guess there's a lot of kind of climate stuff in it as well. And that again is informed by the science, but is not narrowly, I guess, kind of narrowly reliant on the science, so some of it, I mean, but having said that, I was about to say some of it's a bit worse possibly than the science says it's going to be. I think as each week passes, it becomes clearer and clearer that probably I'm underestimated what things are going to be. I mean, it's really interesting when I was writing with the climate stuff, there's all this stuff about fires all the way through it. And then, that sense that the reality is lapping you while you're writing it. These things are getting so much worse while you're actually writing than the thing you've invented that's meant to be in the future. So...
yeah, maybe we shouldn't let you write anymore. Maybe you have a power to change things more quickly than the science says they will. No more books for you.
I wish that were the case.
Yeah. Laura, how about you? What was your research process like for figuring out how animals actually talk?
I did so much research. I'm a doctor of animals talking in books now. And I did a lot of physical research as well. I lived in wildlife parks. I went to the States and spent time in sanctuaries. But as James said, and I've got it all written down somewhere, and there's many, many folders, but it comes down to, sort of the way that a crocodile's leg, bends, and as they launch off the sand, to go and catch some prey, or the way that a chimpanzee in a Florida sanctuary who used to star in movies looked at me like I was his friend, or the sound of a refrigerator in a caravan, which I recorded for some reason and just listened to over and over again, even though it doesn't appear anywhere in the novel. It's a very scattergun approach to researching. When it comes to actually sort of representing the animals and especially the way they speak, I don't even know if I'd call it research as in rather than a complete rethinking of the way that I write dialogue and think about dialogue. I started writing bad songs. I put those bad songs through Google Translate and translated them into Latin and sometimes Finnish. And then I would put them on the page and move them around until somehow the voice of a dingo comes through, who speaks in I guess poetic line breaks and parentheses. It's not a very easy thing to explain. I don't know that I'll ever write that way again, but it was what the novel and the animal dialogue needed, because I'm really passionate about dialogue and the way that dialogue is and what it does to characterization and to action. But to make a mosquito really come through in a dialogic way, it was a real test of my abilities as a human and a writer.
Yeah, it's such a tricky thing to take on, and I think you really nailed it. I mean, obviously I can't speak mosquito, so I can't say if it was accurate or not, but it's the balance that you struck between that alienation and dislocation from the voice, because it's not human, but still having comprehensibility at an intellectual and an emotional level, I think it's superb. It's really, really great. I love it.
Good.
Yeah. How about you, Chris? You can't go like hang out with mammoths like Laura could with dingoes. What was your process like for getting inside a mammoth head?
I think sometimes the authenticity of research can hang over a novelist's head a bit like the sword of Damocles, and that when you have a book that comes out, there's this intense pressure to convince people that you did it right. And so you have to basically, whether you did research or not, you have to say you did, but what is research? Yeah. What is actual research? I mean, James could read books about Neanderthals. Laura's recording her refrigerator sound or something like that. And so, it can be many different things. And sometimes you're not even aware as an author that you're doing it. You're, going for a bushwalk and you're accidentally researching something that will pop into your work later on, and you're not even aware of it happening at the time. I was sitting in the audience at the Melbourne Writers' Festival years ago when the British writer Camilla Shamsi was on stage. She was talking about her book Burnt Shadows at the time, which had scenes that were set in Japan immediately after, in Hiroshima, after the nuclear bomb had been dropped. And it was a real lesson for me sitting in the audience listening to her, because she made a mistake on stage that made me realize what this writing gig was all about. The place was packed, and someone said to her, you must have done an incredible amount of research for this book. How long did you spend in Japan? And she said, Japan? Oh, I've never been to Japan. Really offhand. And they said, but your book's set in Japan. She goes, yeah, the internet. And there was an audible groan in the auditorium. And a lot of people just walked out at the end. They didn't buy her book. They were actually like disgusted by the fact that she hadn't done it correctly. She hadn't gone and lived in Japan, lived the life of a Japanese woman in the post-World War II period. And so therefore her book was inauthentic to them at that point. And that, set a little alarm bell off me. I was just early in my career then. I thought, oh, bloody hell, you have to be careful what you say when you're talking about research. You have to sort of be a bit sly and semi-convince people, oh yeah, I read all these amazing, books, and I spent, 22 years of my life researching, and I did 3 PhDs. I did do a lot of research for the book, don't get me wrong. Definitely have to say that now. But the format of it was probably quite alternative, I guess. It can be watching an old caveman movie, that can be research. And going down internet rabbit holes and indulging yourself and ordering out of print, old academic books online that you're maybe only going to read one chapter of because they're so boring when you get them. Yeah. I quite enjoy what you might call research, but I couldn't really define what that is.
For sure.
It's interesting though. Camilla Shamsi. The thing you need to know about Camilla Shamsi, as well as being a Booker Prize shortlisted author who writes kind of august introductions to Virago classics, she's got another life writing about Dungeons and Dragons novels, which she's really into, and she writes for Tor.com. Right? Yeah. Well, unless there's 2 Camilla Shamsis who are writers, and I'm pretty sure that there aren't. But what I was going to say is there's something, I sometimes wonder whether there's a kind of anxiety about the legitimacy of fiction. Like that kind of, I feel like one of the things that has happened to us over the last 20 years or 30 years has been a kind of erosion of our trust in the idea of the imagination. And so we've become very, very wary, I think, about fiction itself. So one of the things we get very anxious about is what is the thing that legitimates the fiction? What makes it okay? And research is one of the things we turn to all the time for that. And there's a kind of level at which I think sometimes that's a useful anxiety, and particularly when we're talking about dealing with other people's stories and speaking for other people and those kinds of things. They're genuine concerns. But there is also something going on there about a kind of erosion of our belief in the idea of fiction and what fiction does and what it's there for, that it's this kind of unruly imaginative process, that doesn't always take us to places that feel comfortable or what we would expect. So
yeah, I had an audience question asking about the pandemic element of my novels, and they said, how did you know? How did you know it was going to happen? And as much as I would have liked to have said, I fast forwarded myself to 2020 because that's where we all want to spend more time, and, learned all the facts about pandemics and went back in time and popped it in. I just had to break it to them that it was a plot device.
Yeah, I feel like this period is this period of where we're living in a dystopia now, if you will, is awakening lots of readers to the idea that there are a bunch of books out there that are imaginary. I think this is kind of a slightly new idea for a lot of people, that they're realizing that people do imagine different futures And then when you read them, having only read very realist fiction, you're like, how did they know this would happen? But there are actually loads of books out there imagining all kinds of different futures. Anyway.
Having said that, oh, sorry.
Yeah. No,
having said that, and I think we've all touched on this somewhat in other discussions, we have written these books. We have, all four of us have been writing these books in the last decade when the pressure of climate change and the pressure of political polarization and the whole world is under pressure. So we are responding to these things just through our everyday life, and that just infects our novels. So it's not surprising that we're, predicting the future, because we're
alive.
We're alive.
Yeah. And Laura, I guess that kind of leads on to you. You and I have spoken before about the extinction crisis and the role that writers might have in either like reflecting that or combating it in some way. How important do you think that understanding of animal consciousness and artistic representation of that consciousness might be in fighting extinction, I guess, if that's not too long a bow to draw?
Almost essential, I suppose. We've spent a long time ignoring the fact that we share this planet with other species, plant and animal, and many other forms. And we're just very noisy humans. We just don't shut up, and we go on and on about, we've been going on and on for a very long time about how fantastic we are. And it's very obvious that we're not only not fantastic, but pretty idiotic. And that part of the animal turn, this turn towards animals and the environment, is necessarily a shutting up and listening. And I suppose because I write and that's all I can really do, it's important to me to foreground non-human species in novels. And I'm not saying we need to completely shift human characters aside. My novel is told from the perspective of a human character, but just to recognize that maybe humans aren't the only thing in the world, and if we start to represent and listen to animals in our fiction and make them central characters. Your cat is trying to get out the door, by the way. She's trying to escape. Yeah, so just that decentering of human characters and centering of non-humans, it was essential to me in trying to address some of the ideas in the book.
Yeah, for sure. And Chris, I feel like that you kind of frame your book within a few ideas about how humans should probably shut up and have made a lot of stupid mistakes. Is there anything that you would like to add to what Laura said about the role of literature in pushing humans out of the frame a little bit, and why that might be important?
Well, a bit like Laura and James especially, I mean, his last novel, Clade, was a fantastic novel that I listened to him speak at the Adelaide Writers' Festival about, and it was also about climate change and how the world is not being run very well by us humans. And it got me thinking at the time, in the early days of when I was working on this, about how one of the main sort of important themes that I wanted to talk about was extinction. But how do you do that? It's a huge topic to talk about. What's the way in? And for me, the way in was through these bones of extinct animals, mainly because a lot of them are being de-extincted. And James mentions this at the start of his book, and that's what his billionaire is all about. Changing the climate of the planet by bringing back these creatures and Neanderthal that are no longer around. And that sounds like, pure science fiction. And it always, as a kid, of course, we all saw Jurassic Park and we imagined what it would be like to have, long dead creatures return to the earth. But it's kind of happening now. Just yesterday, the Siberian Times, which is an excellent newspaper for anyone who wants to check it out. It really is. They just announced yesterday that and they had some amazing photographs, that they have found a complete intact carcass of Ursus spelaeus, which is the cave bear. And it's got flesh, blood, everything. And so they've got DNA. So that's yet another species that they're going to perhaps try to bring back. And that is kind of the terrifying tipping point, because everything else they're talking about de-extincting are fairly innocuous creatures. There's the passenger pigeon, a prehistoric horse, the Tasmanian tiger, which I guess might give you a little nip or something. A very small nip around the ankles. A mammoth is admittedly a huge creature to bring back, although they are probably going to do it. But it could stomp you to death, but it's not going to rip your head off and eat you. But a cave bear is 1,000 kilogram, 4 meter high animal. It's an apex predator. And if they're going to bring one of those back, whoa, you're starting to get into pretty scary territory there. And to touch on what Laura said, that's sort of mankind's obsession with itself and belief that we are the cleverest thing on the planet, when really we just make mistakes all the time. And my book is kind of about showing you what might happen if we make some of those mistakes, and even just questioning the idea of who's collecting these bones, what purposes are they collecting them for, why do they want them. It's all to do with human hubris and arrogance, and the scientific community are not always don't always make the best decisions in this regard. They will probably forge forward and bring creatures back, whether we want them to or not, and whether the creatures want to come back or not, and possibly for noble reasons. But is it going to work out? Probably not.
Let's see. James, I guess you thought quite a lot about de-extinction when you were writing your book. Obviously, the hubris of a billionaire combined with some very clever science is at the beginning of your book. Did you form any opinions about whether de-extinction should be an important part of our approach to climate change and to extinction?
I think the first thing to say is that, the thing to remember about human beings is that we are the white men of species. Like, we continually overrate our own importance. And, it's right. I was talking to a fish scientist the other day for a piece I'm writing, and he was talking about the sensory world of fish and just saying, so fish, they see more colors than us. They smell more things. They hear more things. They got magnetic sense. They can feel the water. They've got this incredibly rich sensory world. We think we're so good at everything, but they're so much better than us. And then we're like, that doesn't really matter. So we are the white men of species. The de-extinction stuff's really, really interesting. I guess I came to the book because de-extinction seemed to me to be a really exciting metaphorical idea in a weird kind of way. Chris was talking about the bear being found, the bear in the Siberian Times yesterday, and I agree. The Siberian Times is a great publication. But I was really interested in that idea that the kind of deep past was kind of erupting into the present. It seemed to be such a fantastic metaphor for the kind of derangements of temporality you get with climate change. But I kind of came into this from another direction. I was thinking about kind of rebuilding landscapes and that kind of idea of what happens to landscapes when you put animals back into them that belong there, and the way that there's amazing studies about the way Yellowstone, the courses of the rivers change when they put wolves back. All of that amazing stuff about a great deal of the circulation in the ocean seems to be driven by whale poo. It's kind of like, there's all of that kind of amazing sense that animals influence things. And I guess once you start thinking about de-extinction, I don't know. I'd love to see a mammoth. I'd love to see a thylacine. What I would like to see more is us thinking about the species that aren't gone yet, and actually thinking, because the resources you have to devote to recreate the thylacine are immense. Yet we are losing species on a kind of really rapid basis. Wouldn't it be better to invest that? Do you know what I mean? In a sense that, just at a kind of cost-benefit level, it seems to me that trying to stop extinction is probably more important than de-extinction. But I'm with Chris. In as much as it's possible, I'm pretty confident some version of it will happen and happen soon.
And then we can make them extinct all over again. That'll be fun. on another point, humans often talk about how much we would love to contact alien life forms from other planets, how we'd love to learn from them, while we're, as you say, we're killing off a whole bunch of forms of life here that we could be learning from. I feel like Neanderthals, mammoths, and dingoes could each give humans a hot tip about how to lead a better life, and I wonder if you could tell me what that hot tip would be, Laura. What would dingoes tell us about how to do a better job?
In the novel, Jean, the human character, sort of makes up these really daggy sort of, affirming little, what are they called, platitudes, or little notes to herself, like get up with a smile, run all the while, smoke in the meantime, just little notes to herself, and she sticks them around the house, and she speaks in these sort of things, like the goddess is dancing, that sort of stuff. And I don't know whether dingoes would do this, but I've been thinking a bit about this question, Jane, and all that came up was stop, look, and listen, which is actually an ad from the 80s about how children should and should not cross the road. That's what. And there's a lot of, I think, Take 5 do a song about it these days, just to modernize that, and it's really daggy and silly to think that the incredible animal that is a dingo would say this, but I guess it came to mind because of that idea of us shutting up for a second, and to drag this really childish metaphor on, I suppose we are sort of at the crossing of a road. We are just about to run out in traffic, and in fact, we already have, and maybe we just need to stop for a second and look at other things and listen. That's what I've got.
Yeah, I think that's pretty solid advice from dingoes. How about mammoths? What would mammoths tell us to do?
I reckon they'd probably say, get over yourselves and pull your head in, because who do you think you are? You're not better than us. And that's basically humans' problem in a nutshell, isn't it? Humanity's problem in a nutshell. We do think that we are the apex species, that we're top of the food chain, that the world should revolve according to our rhythms, and that we are somehow separate from the natural world, that we are in charge of it, that we can do whatever we want to it, and Mother Nature will just take her licks and bounce back, and it's incredibly foolish way to live. We could learn a lot from listening to the other species that we share the world with. Like James says, I now want to be a fish, and in Laura's book, the characters, as soon as they realize that they can understand what animals are saying, like a huge number of people want to hear what the whales have to say. And people are wading out into the ocean, killing themselves, trying to listen to the whales. And that was a very, that really sort of touched me, that moment in her book, because I thought, of course we would want to do that, but why aren't we currently doing that?
Yeah. Sorry, did you want to say anything else about that? I interrupted you prematurely then.
No, it was a timely interruption because I was running out of steam anyway.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, we could make more of an effort to listen to all of these creatures now, but we're sort of like, when are they going to talk to us? When are they going to bother to learn our language? And James, was there anything that you learned from thinking about Neanderthals that you think would be useful for us to apply now?
Well, I think, like both Chris and Laura, my general view is the lesson you want to take away is pay attention and don't be such a dick. Look, I mean, I think what it would be nice for us to do is to recognize there are different ways of being in the world, and that our way of being in the world, our way of encountering the world is not better, as Chris said, it's just different. But those ways of being in the world are themselves extraordinary and individual in the way that ours is. And so what we lose when a creature goes out of the world is not just its kind of genetic material, but its culture, its kind of, well, there's that German notion of the Umwelt, the kind of inner life, the inner presence of the animal, the inner world of the animal, and we lose that, and we lose a way of being in the world when things disappear. I was saying before, I've been writing about fish for something, and I mean, people don't think about fish, and I think oftentimes we don't think about them because it's too horrible once we do. But fish recognize themselves in mirrors. Fish can point. I mean, fish actually engage in referential behavior where they point at things. No other species except for humans, a couple of primates and ravens can do that. Some fish, some fish recognize themselves in mirrors, and, that's been the gold standard test for individual self-recognition for 50 years. I think noticeably the fact that our response to that is the test must be broken tells us something about our kind of preconceptions there. But, like the idea that fish, something we give so little thought to, are conscious, sentient, thinking creatures with culture and, kind of a way of being in the world, is something that it's really worth thinking about. So,
yeah, for sure.
It's very transformative once you think about that the notion there are other ways of being in the world.
And as you said earlier, James, it's great that fish, can point and recognize themselves in mirrors, but in a way it's those other abilities that we can barely comprehend. So the ability to see colors that we will never see, the ability of bats to see the world through sonar, the fact that whales are these giant mammals that live under the earth. In a way, to me, that's the extraordinary intelligence of other animals that we don't necessarily tap into or recognize enough.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting, and I was writing about this in something recently, but we think of the things that we value about ourselves, which is our culture, language, all of those kinds of things, but the idea that we're these intelligent creatures who understand where we are in the world and all that kind of thing is what we think is special about ourselves. But, if we look at fish or we look at cephalopods, so octopuses and squid and things like that, it's really clear that they are the same. They are incredibly ancient. It's likely that those things were swimming around in the oceans 200 million years ago, having thoughts, being intelligent, having culture that they pass from one to another. It's not something that suddenly came into the world a million years ago when we popped up. It's been around for hundreds of millions of years. And the notion that we're something special arrayed against that span of time seems to me to be just unbelievably arrogant.
And yeah, I think of us doing those kinds of experiments that you're talking about, like getting creatures to look in a mirror and whether they can recognize themselves and go, oh, no, they can't. They're all idiots. And I wonder what other species, what sort of experiments they're doing on us at the moment that we're wildly failing all the time. That the fish are like, have you seen this species? They can't even smell properly. They're so dumb. Anyway, I thought I would ask you a little writing question for all the aspiring writers out there. Each of you writes novels, short stories, and also nonfiction. So when you get an idea in your head, how do you decide which one of those forms you're going to use to have a go at it, Chris?
I'm quite good at separating things, but there is a bit of a bleed that goes on, a bit of mission creep sometimes. Like this week, for example, I have to write a piece on the history of the plastic bag for the National Museum of Australia. And that's going to be quite a lot of fun to do, I think. I mean, I've got to do a bit of research this time. I'm not going to just do a Camilla Shamsi on this one. And I've got to actually do some research on the plastic bag. But that is a nonfiction piece. But it's true that I may come across something during when I'm on my little rabbit holes, finding out about the history of the plastic bag. I will often come across maybe an historical character, and I'll think, "Ooh, that's a good little thing to put aside," and I'll put that off to one side in a little folder, and perhaps that character then will pop up later on in a very minor way, in a piece of creative fiction. The way my brain works, and I suspect it's probably true for a lot of creatives, is it's absolute bedlam in there. It's just chaos, and I never really know what's going on. And the ideas that pop into my head because I will read an article about something, or read a novel or a short story or a poem, and it sparks something in my head, and I have no idea what that's going to end up creating in my head. And it's very frustrating because I wish it was simpler. And when you have a book out, especially the kind of books we've written, and people are asking you questions because they want to know how you did it. How did you do this? What's the process? I want to follow a process and do the same thing you did. And I never know what to say, because the process is absolutely indefinable for me. It is an absolute mess. It's a miasma of bizarre notions and cultural references and things I read about 20 years ago that pop into my head. So I never really know how to approach the writing world. That's why I can't be a teacher, because I don't know what I'm doing. Like it just seems to somehow come together in some sort of form, and if someone else likes it, I'm genuinely surprised. So I'm probably the worst person in the world to ask about process and that kind of thing.
But I guess that kind of answers that question too about research, which is, like you were saying, it's all the time. It's happening all the time, and you just once you start being a writer, I think that everything's copy. You just are constantly noticing stuff and taking notes about stuff and thinking this will be useful later, or this is a thing, or maybe I'll follow this. And you go back through your files and you're like, what was this idea? What was I thinking? I don't even remember thinking about that. How about you, Laura? What sort of sets you off on a particular path?
Well, I was just thinking a little bit about form. I think I write poems for myself, and my poems are really odd. So that says something about me. They're really strange little things. And I write nonfiction because people keep asking me to. I really wouldn't write it if I didn't get asked to, and I'm never happy with it. But I'm glad I do it. I think it's a really fantastic form. But I don't like what or I find what I produce a bit too hard for me to read. But with fiction, I think it's the only art form I've ever found where somewhat everything that is happening in here and the way that I see the world, and my sort of deep beliefs that I can't ever explain or wouldn't want to explain to anybody, thus the not nonfiction, can be expressed. And it doesn't come out the way I first see it. I get this really clear still image, and I did study photography, and I think maybe it comes from that. I get it. It's like a Cindy Sherman sort of still. If anyone knows her work, she recreates these fantastic film stills, and it's sort of my job to get it moving again through the words. And I'm also open to mistakes, and it just going off down rabbit holes and up mountains and completely collapsing and me reconstructing it. But what I get in the end is somewhat a version of what's happening in here, and that's very, very satisfying and a really nice feeling.
James, you're constantly working on like 5 different things at once, it seems like. What is it that drives you to write in different forms?
Sorry, before I begin, I think, Chris, we need to, just as ScoMo came to mean bugger off, we need to make Shamsy into like mating it up. So when people say, how did you research the book? And you can say, I just Shamsied it up. Like, it's become a verb. We need to get it into the Urban Dictionary. I just Shamsied this thing up. Look, I mean, for me, in a weird kind of way, it's never a difficult question. Like I never look at something and think, oh, I don't know whether that's a story or nonfiction. Like I kind of know when I look at it, like some things are clearly nonfiction, some things are clearly fiction. But I suspect it's because you're looking for different things. I mean, I think when I'm looking at fiction, I look at something and I think, oh, that's a great idea for a story. Whereas if it's nonfiction, I'll look at it and I think there's something I think is really interesting that connects to some other things. Because I think one of the things you're always doing with nonfiction is trying to make connections between different ideas. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a very intuitive thing. I just look at it and I think, well, that's fiction, that's not. But I mean, it is in a weird kind of way, in an odd kind of way. I probably feel a bit like Laura does about my nonfiction. Like I write a lot of it, and sometimes I feel like I'm okay at it, but I feel like I mean, God, I don't know. So often I think I'm terrible at it, but I do feel like I'm a fiction writer who writes some nonfiction, if that makes sense. Like I kind of came to the nonfiction from the fiction. But also for me, one of the differences always is with the fiction, it's such an amorphous, strange kind of, I mean, I think Laura said it's kind of everything that you know goes into it. But with nonfiction, it's often something where you're saying, here is something I want to write about that I can get in the world in 2 months' time. And it might move some people's ideas about something. It might communicate something to these people that they haven't seen before. It might change something. So there's this kind of sense that the fiction is about trying to explore or explain something to yourself. Often the nonfiction is about trying to take something to someone else. Does that make sense? So I think there's one's for you, one's for other people. Perhaps that's what I'm trying to say. It's not a very answer, I'm sorry.
No, but I think that's also true because, like, if it's a novel, you may be with that for 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. It needs to have that. It needs to have some strong function for yourself for you to keep doing it. Whereas an essay, that might take you a couple of months, and
Yeah, look, I mean, there's also that, nobody reads fiction. Some people do read nonfiction. So the novel is actually for yourself because no one else except for you and the editor and your mother will ever read it. But
which perhaps leads into we have a question from the audience here from Dorothy Simmons, who would like to know, and this I think was based on your earlier comment about imagination, James. Are we too used to getting answers from our reading rather than finding better questions to ask as a result of it? And as a kind of follow-up to that, do the three of you think of yourself as genre-busting writers? You could answer either, both, or none. Who wants to go first?
I really think that if there was a definition of good fiction for me, which obviously is up for it as a whole other panel, I would say it's work that asks questions rather than seeking to answer them. To me, when I read a novel, or the novels I read open up doors, it's, and I feel that in all of your work, the doors just fly open. I don't know what it is, what the definitive answer to bringing back extinct creatures is, but I have a billion questions about it and I want to know more after reading your works. Increasingly, I think there has been a kind of knowing, canny style that has come through that seeks to answer questions in fiction, and it's sort of, and I don't love that work. I find I don't want an author to answer the questions about the world. That's what I've got to say.
Either of you like to add to that? I would like you to.
I'm not keen on fiction that lectures me. I was never a very good student, and so as soon as someone tries to give me a lecture, I switch off pretty quick or start pinging elastic bands at my neighbor or something like that. In terms of genre busting, that's an interesting question to ask. The literary world is a funny beast in that it attempts, in order to sell books, to classify them in certain genres to make it easier for people to know what it is they're buying. And somewhere along the line, I mean, Laura and I have talked about this privately recently, somewhere along the line, literary fiction became the be-all, end-all. This is the most amazing genre, and anything, and these are the books that win prizes and that win the Booker Prize, and you're not really, anything else is a lot of rubbish. And that really gets on my nerves. Because I've always loved fiction that crosses quite comfortably between genres. I love literary fiction if it has a slight fantastical element to it. Or I love science fiction that has a very realist element to it. And I admire writers who can do that. Or even just, science fiction that is pure imagination. I'll read a science fiction novel and think, my God, these are the ultimate writers. They can create entire worlds on people and languages and places that we just cannot conceive of. How did they do this? Like, to me, that's the ultimate, and yet they're considered to be the lowest of the low in the literary world, And so that I find that frustrating. I think everyone should be a genre buster and should be absorbing all the different genres of writing that are out there and trying to, I wish more writers did that.
James, you're often cited as a genre busting writer. What do you reckon?
To go quickly back to what Laura was saying, I mean, I kind of agree. You want books that, it seems to me that writing, people make this mistake of thinking that writing is something where the author kind of knows what they're saying. And it seems to me that writing, the act of writing and what's on the page is actually a way of thinking itself. So it's a kind of, both when you're writing a novel, what you're doing is thinking something through, and the act of writing is your way of thinking it through, and it's a kind of intuitive, emotional logic that you're kind of working with, and I think for the reader as well, that's usually what it is as well. I mean, if it's a good book, you go into it and you're kind of absorbed into this world and changed, and it's if it's giving you clear answers to things, I think it's probably, maybe it's just that I'm never certain what I think about anything, but, I feel very wary when other people are very certain what they think about things in fiction. I don't know about the genre thing. I don't particularly like the genreification of things. It doesn't seem, I think it is a useful way of talking about books some of the time, but as Chris said, it's often a really restrictive way of thinking about books. In my own work, I don't actually pay very much attention to it. I mean, I feel like what you get from genres they're kind of toolboxes that you work with, and so I'm very happy to just kind of borrow things from genres, and to kind of look at them and think, well, what does this do? What kind of story will it let me tell? What kind of questions can I address using the kind of tools of that genre? Because the genres come with their own toolboxes. Science fiction is particularly good at doing certain kinds of things. Horror is particularly good at doing certain kinds of things. Crime is particularly good at doing different things again, and depending on the kinds of stories you want to tell, those genres will offer ways of doing that. You can borrow from them. Yeah, but I don't think they're rigid categories at all. They're just kind of, I'm now rambling hopelessly. I'm going to stop.
Well, I guess I would add to that, even though I'm not on this panel and I'm just meant to be asking you questions, that perhaps I think for all four of us, we all write, we probably all read a great deal. And I think when you're in a position where you're reading loads and loads of books, those things stop being important, because you've got time to experiment. You've got time to pick up whatever and have a read of it and see if you enjoy it, and it doesn't matter so much. If you've got time to read 2 books a year, you like crime, you're like, just give me the crime book. That's what I need right now. I don't have time to suddenly discover this book is narrated by an octopus and have to go find another book because this is rubbish. So yeah, I think genre is a really useful tool for people who are in a hurry or don't have much time and just want something they'll like. We're lucky. We get to do a bunch of reading. It's fun.
I think ultimately in my work, I'm aiming towards writing books that are literary, adventure, horror, science fiction, crime novels.
I want to read that book.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. But trying to convince publishers and readers that this is a good thing is not that easy. Just saying, but which is it? Is it a crime? Yes, it's also historical, and it's got horror and spaceships. Oh my God, what's wrong with this guy?
The good news is
but I like all kinds of books. Why wouldn't you? I mean, I don't get the idea that I don't get the idea that books need to be about a particular thing. Like, I like all kinds of books. I want to read books that are, incredibly searing depictions of kind of life right now, for particular people. But I also want to read books like, I just read the book that won the Hugo, the Memory Called Empire, the Arcady Matan book, which is lovely, and it's set on this weird galactic empire where they make up poems. It's kind of like, it was great. I really enjoyed it.
I was on a speculative fiction panel yesterday, and it was a great panel. Just this sort of female, multicultural, passionate panel of very hard-out speculative fiction writers. And I realised about halfway through, or very early on, that I had to out myself as, sort of someone who thought of themselves as a literary fiction writer, maybe, who is a bit speculative. And it was a real outing, and people were a bit shocked. And when I mentioned that maybe my next novel, seemed to be going in a what they call a speculative way, I got an ovation. The audience clapped because they felt like, and they said, we've drawn you over to the dark side. So there is, I guess, I think that what genre does for writers anyway is that it does give people quite a sense of community. There's not really a literary fiction community. We sort of work in our bubbles, and every now and then we see each other on screens, and it's really lovely. But there does seem to be very strong communities in science fiction, in the horror community. Yeah,
I did an event with the fantasy author Raymond E. Feist. He's got a new series of books out, and it was before the pandemic, I suppose about 18 months ago, and it was at a theatre in Melbourne. And there was, I don't know how many, there was about 2,000 people there or something who turned up to watch him talk for an hour about his book. And the book signing afterwards, it went all the way through the theatre, out onto Collins Street, down Collins Street, around the corner onto Swanston, past the town hall, down to Burke Street. There were thousands of people, and they had stacks of his books. And I was helping him, and we're like, oh my God, we're going to be here till 2 in the friggin' morning. And we had to, introduce rules to say, okay, you can only have 3 books signed, because otherwise, and this was just one event on his tour. He was off to do Comic-Con or something next. Oh my God, this is what this guy's life is like. Like, literally millions of people read these books. It's quite a shock when you come from the literary fiction world, where you go to an event and it's, the 3 of us and 6 people in the audience all looking at us really sternly, because they think we're shamsieing it.
Nice callback.
Speaking of which, we have a question in from the audience. Peter Klein says, "This is the first time I've heard of any of your books, but I enjoyed listening to you today right around the Murray, and I'm going to buy them all. Besides writers' festivals, how do you promote your work to attract readers?" James?
Thanks. You have a publicist at your publisher who gets you on the radio, and you do things like that, radio and maybe TV, and books get reviewed in papers and things like that. But increasingly, you're expected to do huge amounts of online stuff, which honestly just makes me I feel like I need a shower after I've done it. Like, they're kind of like, in fact, my publisher was in fact praising another writer who we all know, who they thought was doing an amazing job of what she got. I should pull the email up. She said something about the kind of, the self-promotion and hustling online that you need to do, about kind of performing online, about their complete delight that the book's gone into reprint or whatever it is. Yeah. And, I'm just kind of like, I look at that stuff and I just think, oh, I feel like gross even thinking about doing that. But it is funny, isn't it? Clearly some people that kind of version of they do of themselves on Instagram, which is increasingly what you have to do to promote books, comes really naturally to them. But it would have seemed to me that I find it weird that so many writers find it so easy, because it just gives me the horrors.
None of them find it easy though, James, but we're all like, all right, let's go. Let's be that person.
I don't know if writers are the greatest promoters of their books, and I'm not sure many writers are very good at it. And it is an interesting question, though, Peter's asking, How do you promote your work to attract readers? Because I don't think anyone really knows the answer. And we're asked to do festivals, we're asked to do podcasts, interviews on radio, interviews in the newspaper. If you're lucky, you get asked to do these things. But do they work? Who knows? Like there's no way of measuring, short of being Ray Feist and having thousands of people waiting for you in the street. It's very hard to measure whether it has what has an effect and what doesn't have an effect on book sales. We could be sitting here today chatting, amusing people with our banter, and all of our books sell 1,000 copies after this, and we think, oh, okay, how come that didn't happen at the event last week? And how come I spoke, on a podcast that has 100,000 listeners and we only sold 2 books? Like it's really difficult to measure what is a good thing to do to promote your work and what is an ineffective thing. It's a real head scratcher. It's really annoying.
I reckon there are 3 things that are really successful for promoting books. One is...
Oh, good. Here we go.
One is having written the right kind of book that's promotable and having a massive campaign put behind it by your publisher, which is one, and that can sell books. Now, if the book's no good, you won't manage to do it a second time, but you can do it with one book. The other thing that sells books is if it's a book that booksellers decide they really, really love, it will move the book out there because they hand sell that book really hard. And the third thing that sells books, and this is the one that really counts at the end of the day, I think, is actually just word of mouth. Like, books that people like, they tell other people about, and so if your book's not selling, because no one likes it. But that is it's that thing. But I think that word of mouth is the thing that you can't. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can't fake it, you can't make it. It's just got to happen because people like it, and and I think you see that kind of thing.
Yeah, one of the best-selling fiction titles in Australia this year is Pip Williams' book, The Dictionary of Lost Words. That has sold tens of thousands of copies, and you basically never see Pip in the media. She's done very little media for that book, and that's basically word of mouth. Readers buying that book, loving it, and telling their friends about it.
Well, and then the Trent Dalton book, I think, clearly has sold that way as well. People just love it,
Yep. I know I had it pressed upon me by many, many people. You've got to read this book. This is the best book ever. It's such a great book. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Wonderful,
Yeah, that people are finding books that they love is so good. Is that, Laura, did you want to add anything to that?
I think finding the right publisher is really, really important, and it's really not about the big, however many we have in Australia, the big 4, the big 5. I'm not very savvy with that stuff. It's about, and I've had this experience this time with Scribe, of finding a publisher who is on the same page as me, every page with the book, and who is going to stand behind it and just get it everywhere, and has a really good relationship with booksellers, and introduces me to them. And so now I have a relationship with some booksellers, and it makes a huge difference. And it doesn't mean that it's going to sell billions and billions of copies, but knowing that you have someone behind the book, and also trusting your publisher and going, I like what they produce, and I believe what they produce, and I know they're not going to put out a novel or a book that that unless they're really behind it. But yeah, I would reiterate, just it's not necessarily, the big publishers do beautiful, brilliant stuff, and we're so lucky in Australia to have good independent publishers. And
I'm published by a big 4 publisher, but it's okay.
No, they do great stuff, but it's not for every book, and it's not necessarily
some great stuff. There is some great stuff.
Because I do know people who've gone with the big publisher over an independent publisher because they're really wowed by the fact that they are a big publisher, and it hasn't been the right book for that publisher, and it hasn't been the right publisher for that book, and it just sinks. It doesn't happen. Whereas other books like James Bradley's obviously have exactly the right fit, and just it's perfect. It's a marriage.
We'll probably, if someone else wants to ask a question, I reckon we'll have time for one more after I have asked this question, which is, when you're using Windows and you get a little annoying pop-up message that says, would you recommend this experience to your friends? I wonder how likely are you to recommend being a writer to your friends? People you genuinely care about. Would you tell them, yeah, do it. Be a writer. It's great. James?
It probably depends on what day you catch me. Oh, look, I mean, I think I've been really blessed. I've been working as a writer for basically doing not much else for 20-something years. And that has been really difficult at times. It's been difficult both emotionally and certainly financially lots of the time. But it's also been wonderful. I spent a really long time doing what I love. I spent my entire life growing up thinking my dad was a philosopher and thinking I don't want to end up like my father. My whole life was about not being my father. And then after he died, I realized that I spent my time sitting in a room full of books, reading and writing, which is exactly what he did. So despite my attempt not to become my father, I became my father. But yes, no, so yeah, look, I mean, I would recommend it in that sense. But, yeah, in a qualified way. It might depend on what day you catch me.
Yeah. How about you, Laura?
I really like what James Carver. You see how I think about
Raymond
James
Carver.
Bradley.
Raymond.
Yeah, Raymond Carver. I like what Raymond Carver has to say about writing. If you're not going to put heaps and heaps and heaps of work into it, there are so many other good things you could be doing in the world. You could be making a lot of money. You could be saving the environment. And so if someone wanted to write, if they really, really love sitting for years and working on the same thing, and they're going to put their everything and they're going to rip themselves to shreds over it, then absolutely they should be a writer. But otherwise, I don't know, go and solve world hunger or something.
Learn the clarinet.
Yeah, learn the clarinet.
Chris, how about you?
I think you probably know that you are a writer from a fairly young age, and it's not something you can do very much about necessarily. In one of Jules Verne's novels, Mysterious Island, and it's a bit of a spoiler. About halfway through, they realize that Captain Nemo is living underneath the island. But when they meet Captain Nemo, he's been living in absolute isolation on this island, apart from humanity for a long time, life of a hermit. And they ask him, wasn't it terribly lonely? And I always thought of his response is very similar to what you might say as a writer. And he said, isolation affords me independence of thought and freedom of action. And I think being a writer is quite a similar experience. As a writer, I feel quite free as a person, and freedom is quite an important thing to me. And it's taken me many years to get to the point where I am just a writer, and that's all I do. And I've never felt better in my life now that I've actually got to that point. And yes, it has its ups and downs, and it's financially completely unstable. But as we're now learning, everything is completely unstable. So being a writer is actually not that different to anything else now. It's I'd rather be a writer than a pilot, for example, at the moment. I don't know what they're going to do with all their book learning. So sure, be a writer if you want to embrace a bit of chaos in your life. That's what it is to be human, after all. So you might as well embrace it.
Yep. Yeah. Did you want to say something else, Laura?
Oh, just that in New Zealand, the pilots are becoming train drivers. They've found a place for the pilots.
Is that because trains were the only industry that was as highly unionised as the airline industry?
Possibly.
Wow.
And on that note, I would like to thank all of you very much. Please, everyone, go to the Dymocks online bookstore and buy a copy of James Bradley's Ghost Species, Laura Jean McKay's The Animals in That Country It Doesn't Look Like This, and also, can we see a real one? Yeah, thank you guys. And
Chris's is back there somewhere.
Sure.
And if you're in Albury, Dymocks will mail them to you for free. If you're elsewhere in Australia, they'll send them to you at a discount. If you would like to find out what's on next, there's one more session left, and go to ridearoundthemurray.org.au to log in and watch it. It's called, I think, Future Tense. I should pay more attention. And while you're there, go in the online survey. You can win a 6-pack of festival titles and a dashing tote bag to carry them in. Thank you all so much for being here for this. This was a really great chat, and I really love your openness and your willingness to answer silly questions and how you all chatted to each other. It was really fun. You're all great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.